And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this presentation on nutrition for women's wellness today. Let's get directly into the women's wellness issue. First of all, there are life stages for women, and as you see on this slide, the first stage is adolescent females, where they're reaching puberty and starting their menses, and nutrients such as zinc, calcium, and vitamins A and D are some of the important nutrients for this stage of women's health. Zinc for immune system and hormonal balance, calcium and vitamins A and D for bone mass and skeletal structure, of course. Weight concerns and especially poor diets, fad diets, dieting become concerns, and as recent studies have shown, supplements really can help bridge those gaps, especially multivitamins. Now, the next stage of women's life is young adulthood, and the physical development is mostly fairly complete here, but now there's emotional and mental development, and we start seeing the B-complex vitamins stepping up in importance, especially the folate or folic acid, because girls approach their childbearing years and they require this nutrient specifically for the formation of babies. And another one that's important is DHA, both for the child and young adults and for the childbearing. DHA is an important component of the brain and nerves, but remember, the brain develops not only through the teens, but it's estimated to continue developing until about age 25, which gives a great need for nutrients such as DHA that are part of the brain's literal structures. So as women enter their childbearing years, hormonal balance becomes a little trickier, and one thing that is important is iodine for the thyroid hormone production. Iodine and the amino acid L-tyrosine are both used to produce the thyroid hormones, along with a couple of minerals. And folic acid and iron, of course, are important nutrients for childbearing. Omega-3, not only for the brain development, but now for mood support, immune response. DHA does become, of course, more important if a woman conceives a baby and is pregnant. And the next phase of women's health is menopause. And at this point, growth, development are all really fairly complete. You've plateaued. But now there's a hormonal balance change. Estrogen production tends to decline, and phytoestrogens become more important as a substitute for the hormones produced by the woman. And this includes the legumes, such as soybeans, pinto beans, chickpeas, also flax and red clover. And then the skeletal health really also plateaus, but then there's a concern about maintaining the bone density. And digestion tends to take a hit here. Enzymes, probiotics, fibers seem to become more important. Digestion and stomach acid is less effective. And a lot of times the metabolism is changing so that when both men and women get into their 40s, they might find they can't eat as much as they did when they were younger and burn it off, that their metabolism seems to slow, their digestion seems not as good, and they need to compensate. Next phase is post-menopause, and we see the estrogen production decline even more. Phytoestrogens increase even more in importance for helping to balance that. There's also issues like the aches and pains we all get as we age, cognitive support, because as we age, we might get a little more forgetful or have more to remember even. The bone retention becomes more and more important, and cardiovascular health really comes to the fore. And post-menopause, one of the issues is that the monthly cycle, the menstruation, uses nutrients such as iron and depletes them and increases the need for that. But then at menopause, that extra need really stops, and we start seeing the cardiovascular risks for women and men start to equalize, where before the risk was higher for men. And it's believed that part of that is due to the depletion of iron during menstruation that ceases. And now with higher iron stores, the women become more at risk for cardiovascular issues because of the change in the way they're retaining nutrients. Now, the mature woman past menopause, there's really a focus on healthy meals. How many times do we see, especially if a woman loses a husband or a life partner, or the children move out of the house and it's a single mother, it's harder to make meals for one person than for a family. And some women, frankly, they don't really know how to cook for one, and they start losing interest in preparing healthy full meals like they would for somebody else. Digestion is still an issue. They might not be eating as much protein, especially with irregular eating or grazing, which might mean their muscles, their neurotransmitters, their enzymes, their hormones, all the things that protein does in the body now become more at risk. And if they're staying out of the sun, as is often recommended, there's a lack of vitamin D. And you see that even more in dark-skinned people, people who are institutionalized, people who are at higher latitudes, people who simply don't go out in the sun very much without sunscreen. So there's a lot of issues involved with that, where vitamin D becomes more important, and where a lot of physicians are seeing low vitamin D in a lot of their older patients. Now, there are some functional doses of nutrients needed for bone health. And if you look at this list, you're really looking at what's in a multivitamin, a good multivitamin, plus some protein and the calcium, magnesium, potassium extra that might be more than you find in a lot of multivitamins. But if you take a multivitamin, if you get the recommended amount of protein, if you get the RDA of calcium, magnesium, and potassium, and the potassium is probably the hardest one to get here, by the way, you really have the nutrients that are proven to be necessary for bone health. So this is why a lot of nutritionists will recommend a good multiple vitamin for most people to cover these bases. Of course, a multiple vitamin will not have the protein, will not have the potassium, and the CalMag is often taken along with a multi that might have lesser amount. By the way, the calcium daily value, the 100% on the nutrition labels, is going up next year from 1,000 milligrams to 1,300 milligrams. What that means is if you see a label that now says 100% daily value for a formula that's giving you 1,000 milligrams of calcium, by September of next year, the companies have to have labeling that says that same 1,000 milligrams of calcium is only 77% of the daily value. It's only 77% of the 1,300 milligrams, which is the new higher daily value. So let's keep going, talking about the women's multivitamins. Eve is a multivitamin that's formulated to provide women. It's an alternative to mass market formulas that have a lot of ingredients that people don't want. They don't want talcum powder. They don't want titanium dioxide. They don't want artificial ingredients. They don't want synthetic vitamin E. There's so many things that women do not want in the mass market multis that are inexpensive, cheap ingredients and additives that you won't find in natural product companies' formulas like the Eve from Now Foods. We have 3 different forms to choose from, including an iron-free version, which of course would be more appropriate for older women who are trying to avoid iron because of cardiovascular concerns or other things. They don't need as much iron as they pass the age of menstruation. So we have tablets, soft gels, and capsules, and they differ largely in their iron content. And if you look at the three, the tablet on the left has 18 milligrams of iron per 3 tablets. The soft gel on the right has 6 milligrams of iron, a low amount, in 3 soft gels. And the one on the bottom, the veg capsules, the 2-piece capsules, have no iron at all. Most of the other formula is largely the same, except on the soft gels. If you look at the right under the black line where it says evening primrose oil and cranberry concentrate and those things, we're able to use more oils, more fat-soluble forms that have not been dried out and diluted in the soft gel. So the soft gel on these kind of formulas like Eve or the men's formula Atom really become the best formula as long as, in this case, you don't mind 6 milligrams of iron. Our men's formulas don't use any iron. But also in the multiple vitamin category is the prenatal. And our prenatal gels with DHA was named the best prenatal in an award a few years ago because it had the DHA and had a very nice formula there, targeting nutrition for the mother and the developing baby. And of course, on prenatals as well as any vitamin, you can make an FDA qualified health claim, which is approved by the FDA, that folic acid in a supplement can reduce the risk of neurotube defects, birth defects, and it works better than the amount in foods. It's actually more bioavailable taking a supplement or fortification form than taking the same amount in a food. And this is the prenatal formula. 250 milligrams of DHA in a 3 soft gel serving is a decent amount. You can get stronger in a large soft gel, but not in a multiple vitamin. And I mentioned vitamin D earlier, and vitamin D becomes something that's unusual because you can get it from sunlight in certain circumstances as well as from certain foods. But most of the foods involved are fortified foods, mushrooms, or specific foods that aren't eaten that often. So when we're looking at which foods actually contain vitamin D, it's oily fish and some oils, fish oils from fish like cod liver oil. And there's a difference in wild-caught salmon and farmed salmon, for example, how much vitamin D is in there. But we're really looking at animal-based foods as the main source unless something is fortified or supplemented. Now, I mentioned we do produce it in the skin, but the farther north you go, the less you produce. The darker skin we have, the less we produce. Winter is an issue. There's only certain times of the year you can produce it depending on where you are. If you avoid the sun, which includes veiled individuals in some cultures, scar tissue, things like that will influence the ability of the skin to make vitamin D. Now this chart is kind of a calculator showing where you are and what time of year and whether you can make the vitamin D from the sunlight. And if you look, for example, we're near Chicago, and in February we can't make any vitamin D. In January we can't make any vitamin D. In November, December we can't make any vitamin D. In fact, when I looked up the angle of the sun from late September to late March, we can't make vitamin D in Chicago or New York or Seattle. And it doesn't matter if we go outside at high noon and take our shirts off and expose ourselves to the sun, there's not enough angle. And that insert on the right, the shadow rule, if your shadow is longer than you are tall, you cannot make vitamin D. If the sun is so low in the sky that your shadow looks taller than you, then it's filtered by too much air and you cannot make vitamin D. That's your rule. So the farther south you go, of course, if you're in South Florida, you could probably go out any time of year and get enough sun to make vitamin D. But a lot of people avoid the sun in those areas. I've seen studies showing people in Hawaii and Florida actually get less solar radiation and make less vitamin D than people in Canada because they're more afraid of going out in the sun without sunblock. Now, vitamin D is known for calcium absorption and transport for bone and dental health. And this is really the approved claim from the FDA. But other organizations around the world, such as the European Food Safety Agency, recognize its role in cardiovascular health, insulin and glucose metabolism, immunity, and cellular health. And experts think that 800 to 1,000 IU of vitamin D is needed. That is not the current recommendation. The Institute of Medicine raised the RDA from 400 to 600 units a day back in 2010. They're just raising, in a year from now, the daily value on labels to match the RDA 8 years later. So a lot of times the science does not follow what the regulatory agencies are doing. They're behind the times. And that same level of supplementation is recommended routinely for anyone who doesn't get out in the sun much or has darker skin where it's harder to make the vitamin D. There's other issues as well that affect our ability to make vitamin D from sunlight. So supplementation, fortification become more important. Now let's talk about folic acid and vitamin B12. Folic acid, or folate, is a B vitamin that's in many foods, and one form of folate called folic acid is the form typically used in dietary supplements as well as for fortification of foods. We need folate material to make DNA and other genetic stuff in the body. Folate's needed for the body's cells to divide for normal aging and replacement of cells in the body. And folic acid is especially recommended for pregnancy at a higher level than normal, 800 micrograms daily. Now, the form of folate commonly found in foods is predominantly methylfolates. They're typically hydrolyzed or digested into the monoglutamate form, which is equivalent to folic acid, in the gut prior to absorption. And then they're actively transported across the intestinal wall into the bloodstream. Along the way, they later get reconverted into a methylfolate form. So that's the fate of folate in foods. Now, this is a complicated chart, but I want to simply point out the arrow pointing to folic acid as a preliminary metabolite of dietary folate. So as I mentioned a minute ago, when you eat folate in foods and you digest it, you end up with something very equivalent to the synthetic folic acid, which is commonly used in supplements. Now, there is an FDA qualified health claim, and there's actually very few of these that the FDA has allowed. And it's 800 micrograms of folic acid can be used to reduce the risk of neurotube defects, which is a birth defect. And it works better than the amount in foods or the form in foods. So the FDA has basically endorsed the concept that the supplemental form of folic acid seems to be more effective than taking the folate in foods. Now, when you take folic acid or when you take foods containing methylfolate and digest them to generate folic acid, there are some subsequent steps of metabolism in the body. And the folic acid is converted in a couple of steps to tetrahydrofolate, and there's a couple forms of that. And then with the aid of some amino acids, as you go down the arrow on the left, you get an intermediate called 5,10 methyl tetrahydrofolate. And this is something that an enzyme called methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase that you see in red there converts into the ultimate form 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, which is the desired form in the body. That is the form that you will use to detoxify homocysteine with the aid of vitamin B12 and convert it into methionine, for example. So there's a cycle going on here. That's why there's two arrows, where the body will take the tetrahydrofolate, convert it to the methyl form, the 5,10 methyl tetrahydrofolate, require this enzyme to promote the conversion into the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, the box at the bottom, which is the methylfolate form that's commonly sold in supplements as a more expensive and specialty form of folates. Now, there are some genetic issues where the enzyme, the methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase enzyme, the MTHFR enzyme, has a decreased activity. These are genetic variations where the enzyme is produced using a slightly different recipe of amino acids, because enzymes are protein-based, and you require more of the substrate, which is the 5,10 methyl tetrahydrofolate, to compensate that it's more slowly converted into the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. Now, this sounds a little complicated, but basically there's some people with genetic issues. Their enzyme is not as effective as normal in converting the 5,10 folate form into the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate form, and because of that, they need more of the substrate, which is the folate supplements, to compensate for the lower activity. So depending on whether they're getting a genetic issue and which genetic issue from one side of the family or another, or both, the enzyme activity goes down, and that means the enzyme is not as effective at converting, and you need more of the substrate, which are the folates, for the enzyme to work on. Now, whether you have this mutation or variation in both genes or not, the treatment is the same. You need to supplement and supply more folates. It can be folic acid, it can be methylfolate. There are some minor advantages to using methylfolate over folic acid, but basically they both work according to the American Heart Association. And according to the National Institutes of Health, there's a specific article on MTHFR that folic acid is still safe. It still will be effective at creating more 5-methyl tetrahydrofolates because you have a larger pool of the material for the enzyme to work on. So what's suggested by the American Heart Association is that the amount of supplements should be adjusted by looking at homocysteine levels and not genetic status alone. So if you have these mutations and you have normal homocysteine levels, you do not need to supplement extra folic acid, B6 or B12, or take a special form of folate, the methylfolate, because you're already making enough of the weaker enzymes to convert these folate forms from one to the other and make more of the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. And while studies say that the enzyme will have reduced activity if you're low or normal folate levels, but if you increase the amount of folate, that it could actually allow the enzyme to work better. Even though the enzyme theoretically is not going to work as well, it seems to work better if you give extra folate. And in this case, it can be folic acid or methylfolate, and you're getting the same results. You're increasing the activity of the enzyme. You have more of the substrate, the 5,10 form of methyl tetrahydrofolate. You're able to convert that effectively into the
methyl tetrahydrofolate, which is the form that's desired. So even if you have these genetic issues, you can still convert as long as you have more of the folates, whether it's folic acid or methylfolate. Now, there are some advantages to taking the methyl tetrahydrofolate over folic acid, but as I mentioned earlier, they're relatively minor. First of all, there's a reduced potential for masking the symptoms of B12 deficiency related to anemia. So you're less likely to mask anemia if you also have a B12 deficiency and you're taking this form of folate instead of folic acid. There's a reduced interaction with drugs that work on a specific enzyme system, and this is really limited to a fairly small category of drugs, certain antibiotics and anti-malarial drugs. So this is not a broad category. And this is the form methylfolate that will pass the blood-brain barrier, where folic acid is inhibited from going through that barrier. So supporting neurological health, and B12 has a relationship to the myelin sheath around nerves and things like that. This is something that methylfolate will do better than folic acid, and it's sometimes been called brain B12. And looking at simply the top two lines on this chart, if you have similar amounts of methylfolate and folic acid, you have similar increase of absorption. They're relatively similar. However, the common forms of methylfolate are glucosamine or sodium salts, which are more soluble than folic acid and absorb a little bit better. So that's why there is a slight difference there. But it's not a tremendous difference, and it's explained more by the salt form, the solubility, than by the form of the folate. And now uses a form of methylfolate that's trademarked and patented called quadrifolate. And it's a glucosamine salt of 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, 5-MTHFR. And people with these genetic issues want methylfolate. They are being told that they can only use this form and that folic acid is not effective or safe for them, which isn't really true, but a lot of people think this, so there's a demand for it. It is a little bit safer than folic acid because it's less likely to interact with those few categories of medications that it might, and it's less likely to mask vitamin B12 deficiency anemia. It is more soluble and bioavailable. It is a little bit better at controlling homocysteine because of that, and it is the form that will cross the blood-brain barrier. So these are the advantages, which are not the, oh no, someone can only use a certain form and the other form is toxic to them, that a lot of people think. That's not really the case. These are really the main proven benefits of methylfolate and this specific form of methylfolate over folic acid.
Now, vitamin B12 is another interesting nutrient where there's some misinformation about that as well. It's essential nutrient. You cannot make it in the body. And we're looking at 15 to 20% of the population deficient, and mostly the elderly, but also vegetarians or certain other population groups. And so this does affect a significant amount of women. But it takes months or years to deplete the body's stores, and it takes a long time to build them up again, of course, as well. Now, you might have heard of intrinsic factor and active transport of B12. The most you could absorb that way is 3 micrograms, half the RDA. We all rely on passive absorption from the intestinal tract at a rate of about 1% of the oral B12 taken to allow us to get enough B12. We all rely on this. And what this means is that if you take 10,000 micrograms and you absorb 1%, that's not anywhere near 10,000. That's more like 100 micrograms that you actually absorb. So you can see why we give such huge doses in supplements, because you only absorb a very small amount. And even if you've had gastric bypass and you don't have intrinsic factor, you can absorb your B12 if you take high enough levels. And in clinical trials, 1,000 microgram orally is as effective as intramuscular injections, given usually weekly. And we've seen in several studies and review studies in this regard, including the Cochrane database of systemic reviews, showing that oral B12 works at least as well. And how many forms of B12 are required by the body? A lot of people in stores and a lot of health food companies, the vitamin brands, are telling people they all need methylcobalamin. They all need the methylated form. That is false. There are two forms in the human body, adenosylcobalamin, which is also known as dibencoxide. Some of you might recognize that as being a sports type supplement, and methylcobalamin. They are distinct pathways, distinct enzyme systems in the body. The adenosylcobalamin is your mitochondrial form. It is your energy form. 2/3 of your B12 is supposed to be in this form. Methylcobalamin is the main form for nerve stability and detoxifying homocysteine. It has limited functionality in the body and is not the energetic form. So those of you who are telling people that you need only the methylcobalamin and you're wondering why these folks don't have as much energy as maybe they could, or they're not getting as quick a result in energy raising because they're not feeding the other pathway. And each one of these pathways is driven by an enzyme. The methionine synthase enzyme requires the methylcobalamin. If you don't have that, you get excess homocysteine. And the adenosylcobalamin is needed for the other enzyme, the methynyl-CoA mutase, to make ATP. It's part of your energy production in the body, your synthesis of hemoglobin, your blood cells. So this is the non-methylated form of B12 that we all need. And there's a role, and we're talking about women and aging and bone health. B12 seems to have a role in healthy bones. And when I mentioned earlier that list of supplements and nutrients that are needed by women for bone health, and B12 is one of them. This is why B12 and folate may increase homocysteine levels, which may interfere with collagen cross-linking. Collagen is part of our bone structure. It's part of our skin structure. It's part of our all of our proteins in our body and our structural support. Balancing the monthly cycles is another interesting area. We have formulas such as Cycle Comfort, which is zinc and ginger, relieving mild cramping, pain, and discomfort. You only use it for the first 4 days. So you're taking 1 capsule 3 times a day for 4 days. It's 12 capsules per cycle. And there's really nothing like it on the market. You don't have to take it that often. But there's really good clinical evidence that it's an effective formula. Female Balance is a more generalized formula with wild yam, vitex, and dong quai, GLA, folic acid, and B6. You do not take this particular formula during menstrual cycle either. This is what the formula looks like. So you take 3 capsules a day. And vitex, also known as chaste tree berry, is typically taken for symptoms of PMS, which I'm not going to go through in a lot of detail here. Dong quai is also used for symptoms of PMS, but not for menopausal symptoms. So that becomes an important nutrient as well. Soy isoflavones are phytoestrogens. They are concentrated in soybeans. So phytoestrogens are something useful for cardiovascular health, endocrine support. And one of our newest formulas, Libido Fem, is a fenugreek extract. And this is one of our first formulas in the area of women's sexual desire, intimacy, arousal, vitality, supporting normal endocrine function in women. Menopause is a huge area. And one reason we came out with a formula like Herbal Pause, it's got 3 very natural and naturally produced extracts of Korean herbs. And one of the reasons we came out with that, it's an alternative to the soy and the estrogenic formulas that are so common in this area. This is a crowded category on the shelves. So it's clinically validated. It is not affecting estrogen receptors. It's not an estrogenic effect or a phytoestrogen effect. And studies show that it relieves the most common symptoms of menopause and perimenopause, such as hot flashes, night sweats, various other things like that. So in clinical trials, they give equivalent of 2 a day of these capsules for 12 weeks, and it significantly has effects on a number of issues such as the hot flashes, sleep patterns, moods, and vaginal dryness. And in a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies, they look at the Kupperman Menopause Index over a 12-week period. It did not affect body weight or hormone levels. So we're showing this is not working by changing your hormones, which is important because a lot of women are on hormone replacement therapy or restricted hormone use, and they need something for these symptoms that's not going to be directly impacting their hormones. So we're seeing a significant improvement in a number of these symptoms, including hot flashes, night sweats, insomnia, joint pain, vaginal dryness, etc. And with statistically significant improvement in a wide range of menopausal symptoms. And so the Herbal Pause with Estro G100 is a very nice formula, and there is a version of this that has soy. And the original one had soy. We waited till they had the studies on the non-soy version because we didn't want to confuse it by using the phytoestrogens. We wanted to have something a little more unique as far as the other formulas that people might have already tried. You know, there's a lot of fear of soy, there's a lot of concern about soy, so we wanted to have a soy-free formula for this. Now, natural progesterone is another area that women should consider, and this is a gentle liposomal cream. It's designed to get into the skin very quickly. We have an unscented and a calming lavender. We're using natural USP progesterone. It is produced from wild yam, but we cannot make progesterone from wild yam in our bodies. That requires a laboratory to do that. It's making the natural progesterone, just like we would make in our bodies, but to make it from wild yam requires more sophisticated than what our bodies can do. So this is the unscented, this is the lavender scent, and we use a metered pump bottle. There's actually a little bladder in there that sucks in every time you pump it, and it shrinks so that you're not getting air into the container, so it stays fresher longer. And with a metered pump, you're getting the right amount every time. You don't have to guess at a certain amount or weigh it or look at the percentage of progesterone in it. So that's an important thing. And you typically get about 60 pumps per bottle. Now, one of our newer products is the woman's probiotic. And we know that the urogenital health of a woman depends on microbes, that lactobacilli are recognized as having a role in maintaining healthy vaginal status, and that the major constituents of the flora, the bacteria in the vaginal and urinary tract, include Lactobacillus acidophilus that protect against colonization of undesirable microbes by both competition and producing acids and hydrogen peroxide. And normal vaginal pH is between 3.8 and 4.5, so it helps maintain that proper pH. Oral intake of Acidophilus LA14 and Lactobacillus rhamnosus HNO01 can transfer into the vaginal area within a week if you take it orally. So taking oral probiotics have been shown to help with maintaining the probiotics in the vaginal area. Now, Lactobacillus has been shown to help calcium absorption, and I've mentioned a couple times the need for the bone density maintenance and fortifying calcium and adding probiotics to milk products or soy milk products increases the solubility of the calcium, because the lower pH from the acids produced by the lactobacillus, the acid-loving bacteria, are going to make the calcium more readily absorbed. And we've added the Bifidobacterium lactis HN019, another clinically validated strain, because it improves the gut transit time, the time from eating to pooping, and the functional GI symptoms in adults. And supplementing with these strains has been shown to improve the healthy, or to support the healthy immune markers in breast milk, and to influence the immune parameters in the fetus, in the baby, when the mother takes it. Now Foods today is the only manufacturer with a ribo printer that can identify the probiotics we're using and not rely on the supplier to tell us what we're buying. We actually have a way to test the genetics of the probiotics and to confirm we're using the appropriate strains that we're claiming on the label. And the last section I have is about cranberries, and this is a source of flavonoids and other active compounds that maintain a clean waste stream in the body. These proanthocyanins are easily absorbed in the digestive tract. They're excreted readily in the urine. So they're going through the system and potentiating the waste stream cleaning. And D-Mannose is a sugar that occurs in plants, including blueberries and cranberries. And we metabolize a very small amount of it, but most is rapidly excreted in the urine also. And it also has a cleansing effect that allows these soluble waste products to be flushed out in the urine and keep our waste streams clean. And because we're not metabolizing very much of it, it is not something that's going to raise blood sugar or interfere with blood sugar. So that's an important consideration. So if you're using cranberry and D-Mannose together, you actually have two products that work together to maintain urinary tract support and a clean waste stream. So I thank you for joining us for the webinar today. Thank you.